Welcome to Dey Weekly. I'm your host, Tim Lyons from Running Through the Jungle. I'll provide a quick recap from Week 3 of the Bengals game, and also provide for you football enthusiasts. I'll also cover the top 5 fantasy point getters from each week, from this week, Week 3. For us, for the Week 3 matchup versus the Washington Commanders, another loss. It started off bad. Commanders marched down the field, scored a touchdown, actually we scored a touchdown first, and then they answered us, and it was just nonstop, just back and forth. Jaden Daniels was 21 for 23 for 254 yards and 2 touchdowns. Joe Burrow, 29 for 38 yards. 29 for 38 attempts. 324 yards, 3 touchdowns. Our offense played great. They played really well. There were some opportunities where we missed, but we did. We were 2 for 3 from field goal range. Evan McPherson missed a 48-yarder, I think it was. It was just the Commanders were taking punches where they were needed. They absolutely taking punches where they were needed. They kept just beating that Bengals defense up. That Bengals defense, like I said, I know I posted it on Twitter and Facebook and messaged it to Brandon and everybody that Bengals defense is just Swiss cheese. There's holes everywhere. There was no stopping Jaden Daniels and the Commanders. That he, for a rookie quarterback, he played a hell of a game. I give him his kudos. I think he's possibly the offensive rookie of the year this year. If he keeps this up, the Commanders promising team. But like I said, though, I'm not going to get too much into it. I'm just going to kind of do my little recap. If you want to hear more from us on this game, check out the Roaring Reactions. And then we will be back on Wednesday for our game against the Carolina Panthers and Andy Dalton. Then we'll possibly Strange Love. I don't know, depending on scheduling and all that stuff. I don't know. But check us out, like, subscribe, share us with a friend. Definitely like and subscribe my channel here on YouTube as well. Like and subscribe as well. But check out Running Through the Jungle with me and Brandon and Justin Lacey. But to the fantasy football stats for this week. Starting with the quarterbacks. Josh Allen versus the Jacksonville Jaguars, 263 yards passing, 4 touchdowns. He had 44 rushing yards and had fantasy points of 30.92. Dak Prescott at number 2 versus Baltimore had 379 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, and had 7 yards rushing and 1 touchdown rushing for 29.86 points. Jaden Daniels versus Cincinnati, we saw what he did. 254 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, 39 yards rushing, and 1 touchdown for 28.06 points. Lamar Jackson versus Dallas had 182 yards passing, 1 touchdown, ran for 87 yards, and had 1 touchdown for 25.98 points. And Brock Purdy at number 5 versus the Los Angeles Rams with 292 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 41 yards rushing, and looks like he had a fumble loss, but he still had 25.78 points. Now to the running backs. Saquon Barkley versus New Orleans had 147 yards rushing, 2 touchdowns, had 4 receptions for 9 yards, and he had a 2-point conversion for 33.60 points for number 1 for the running backs. For number two, Kyren Williams from the Fighting Irish versus San Francisco had 89 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. He had 2 receptions for 27 yards and 1 touchdown for 31.60 points. Then Derrick Henry at number 3 versus Dallas had 151 yards rushing, 2 touchdowns. He had 1 reception for 23 yards for 30.40 points. Chuba Hubbard versus the Las Vegas Raiders had 114 yards. 5 receptions for 55 yards and 1 touchdown for 27.90 points. Then at number 5, Jonathan Taylor versus Chicago had 110 yards rushing, 2 touchdowns. He had 1 reception for 25 yards for 26.50 points. Now to the wide receivers. At number 1, Juwan Jennings for San Francisco. When there was no Debo, there was no Kittle, no CMC. Juwan Jennings, wide receiver for San Francisco versus the Rams, had 11 receptions, 175 yards, 3 touchdowns, and had the most points for the league at 46.50 points. And I believe he only was started in like 7% of leagues. Was he a one-hit wonder? I don't know, but you might want to look at getting him and put him on your roster. At number 2, our own Jamar Chase versus Washington had 6 receptions, 118 yards, 2 touchdowns for 29.80 points. Number 3, Rashee Rice versus Atlanta. He had 1 rushing yard. He had 12 receptions for 110 yards and 1 touchdown for 29.10 points. Number 4, Malik Neighbors, 4 rushing yards. He had 8 receptions for 78 yards and 2 touchdowns for 28.20 points. At number 5, Amari Cooper versus the New York Giants. He had 7 receptions for 86 yards, 2 touchdowns for 27.60 points. Now to the tight ends. Dallas Goedert versus New Orleans had 10 receptions, 170 yards, for 27 points. Cole Kmet versus Indianapolis had 10 receptions, 97 yards, and 1 touchdown for 25.70 points. Jake Ferguson versus Baltimore had 6 receptions for 95 yards. He had 15.50 points. Tyler Conklin versus New England had 5 receptions, 93 yards, and 14.30 points. At number 5, Dalton Kincaid versus Jacksonville. 3 receptions, 41 yards, 1 touchdown for 13.10 points. And to the kickers. Will Lutz at number 1 versus Tampa Bay had 2 PATs. He made 4 field goals for 14 points. Harrison Butker versus Atlanta had 1 PAT and 3 field goals. 1 was 50-plus yards for 12 points. Braden Narveson at Tennessee had 3 PATs and 3 field goals for 12 points. Eddie Pinheiro for Carolina versus Las Vegas had 3 PATs. He had 3 field goals for 12 points. At number 5, Will Ricard versus Houston had 4 PATs and 2 field goals for 12 points. And to the defense. Green Bay Packers versus Tennessee at number 1 had 8 sacks, 2 interceptions, 1 fumble recovery, scored a touchdown, only allowed 14 points for 21 fantasy points. New York Jets versus New England, 7 sacks, 1 fumble recovery, only allowed 3 points, and had 16 fantasy points. Denver Broncos versus Tampa Bay, 7 sacks, 1 interception, 1 fumble recovery, only allowed 7 points for 15 fantasy points. At number 4, Buffalo Bills versus Jacksonville, 5 sacks, 1 interception, 1 fumble recovery, and only allowed 10 points for 13 fantasy points. New York Giants at number 5 versus Cleveland, 8 sacks. Holy cow. Eating Deshaun Watson up. For 2 fumble recoveries, only allowed 15 points and had 13 fantasy points. And now that wraps up the show for today. Sorry, I don't have any other fantasy things right now. I just kind of wanted to get this show over with because the Bengals lost. But anyways, thank you again for viewing, liking, subscribing, sharing with your friends. Remember to check out Running Through the Jungle on YouTube or any of your favorite podcast platforms weekly. Like I said, we have usually our roaring reactions after our games. And then we have our Wednesday show, Running Through the Jungle. And then we will sometimes do a Strange Love crossover with our opponents from that week. And, we want to hear what they have to say about the Bengals and their team. But again, thank you so much for watching Dey Weekly. I was your host, Tim Lyons. Have a great day and take care.